Welcome, everyone. I'm Mahenoor Yusuf, and I graduated from Harvard Business School in 2016 with a Ph.D. I'm also chairing Harvard in Tech Seattle chapter. Harvard in Tech is the official Harvard University-wide alumni group for technology. We hope to further the development of technology through encouraging innovation, providing resources and networks, and promoting technological activity throughout the Harvard community. Today's webinar is getting recorded and will be available at the Harvard in Tech Seattle webpage. I'm here with Roger Hackett, my fellow alum and Harvard in Tech Seattle program director, to moderate a panel discussion about technology innovation in U.S. defense.
Hello.
Roger?
Hello, my name is Roger Hackett and I'm a Harvard alum, HES 2018. I am the president of Ryan and Robbie LLC, where we develop children's books and smart play systems for bilingual children.
Thank you, Roger. So we are so honored to have 5 distinguished panelists joining us today. Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos consults on strategy and innovation, helping organizations position themselves for future trends. She is currently conducting strategic research on technology and the future operating environment for the J5 at the U.S. Special Operations Command. She addressed the United Nations member states at the CCWGED meeting on lethal autonomous weapons systems and keynotes at the Technology and National Security conferences. She speaks and writes on disruptive technology, convergence, innovation, tech ethics, and national security. In effort to raise awareness on AI and ethics, she makes reflectional art about AI, and made a game about emerging technology and ethics called Sapien 2.0. She holds a Ph.D. in political science and security policy from University de Siena. Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos is joining us from Maryland.
Hello.
Next, our next speaker, Lieutenant General Russel Honore, had over 37 years of active service with the United States Army. General Honore is recognized as a national hero after spearheading the post-Hurricane Katrina search and rescue mission in New Orleans in 2005. He was in command of Joint Task Force Katrina, leading the Department of Defense response to Hurricane Katrina and Rita in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Authors of 2 books, Leadership in the New Normal and Don't Get Stuck on Stupid, Leadership in Action. A public speaker and continues to speak and consult nationally on building a culture of preparedness. Honore offers effective solutions to some of the most pressing problems of our time. These include hurricane preparedness, healthcare, and gun control, as well as the less well-known issues of widespread infrastructure failure and the need to intervene in the infamous cradle-to-prison pipeline. General Honore is joining us from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Thank you.
Next, Lieutenant Colonel Jake Sotiriadis is Chief of Strategic Foresight and Futures Analytics at the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability. He has been with the U.S. Air Force over 17 years. As the Air Force Senior Futurist, his work spans the nexus of disruptive technology, geopolitical risk analysis, and alternative futures to shape the joint force of tomorrow. He has held various air staff portfolios at the Pentagon, including Principal China Planner, aide-de-camp to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, and Command Intelligence Briefer to the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force. A career intelligence officer, Dr. Sotiriadis, is fluent in German and Greek and conversational in Spanish. He served as a State Department Fellow at U.S. Embassy Berlin, advising the ambassador on all political and military development impacting U.S. relations with Germany. His work as a thought leader has been featured internationally in The Diplomat, the Defense News, C4ISR Journal, China-U.S. Focus, the Daily Catamaran, and the Middle East Institute. He received his doctorate degree in political science and geopolitical futures from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dr. Sotiriadis is joining us from Washington, D.C. Our next speaker, Arjun Bisen, is a policy advisor and former diplomat with over a decade of experience at the intersection of technology, social impact, and foreign policy. He's currently an advisor on technology policy at Google. Arjun was Fulbright scholar and master's student at Harvard Kennedy School, where he wrote his thesis on tech and foreign policy, founded a startup, and designed a course on tech policy at the Business Engineering and Policy Schools with Professor Ash Carter. He also trained US election officials on cybersecurity, advised Twitter on content moderation, and worked as a product manager for the US Census Bureau's data portal. He served as an Australian diplomat for 8 years, focusing on drafting Australia's cyber strategy, geopolitics in APAC, trade negotiation, and leading large UN aid programs, including during a diplomatic position in Cambodia. Arjun is joining us from San Francisco.
Morning, and pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Arjun. Next, Dr. Sarah Kreps is a professor of government adjunct, professor of law, and a Milstein faculty fellow in technology and humanity at Cornell University. She has written 5 books, most recently Social Media and International Politics in 2020. She also wrote books on drones, What Everyone Needs to Know in 2016, and also Drone Warfare. Her work has also appeared in top political science journals such as the American Political Science Review, World Politics and International Security, policy outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and in media outlets such as CNN, BBC, New York Times, and Washington Post. Dr. Kreps has held fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and the University of Virginia's Miller Center for Public Affairs. She has a BA from Harvard University, MS from Oxford, and Ph.D. from Georgetown. Between 1999 and 2003, she served active duty in the United States Air Force. Dr. Kreps is joining us from New York.
To see you.
So thank you all for joining us. We are so honored to have you here. Today's panel discussion is about technology innovation in US defense. We will explore defense technology policy, all domain operations, quantum computing, DoD partnership in R&D, national defense and economic competitions, and more. Given today's globalized access to knowledge and the rapid pace of technology development, innovation, speed and agility have taken on a greater importance. The US military has historically played a key role in funding and nurturing bleeding edge technologies long before they had commercial applications. The internet, computing, semiconductor, GPS, satellite, and nuclear energy are a few examples of public investment in initial R&D that have helped bring new technologies to mature that eventually crossed over to the private sector. The United States retained its top spot as the undisputed military power in the world, both numerically and technologically. For 2020, United States is ranked #1 out of 138 countries, a report by Global Firepower Review. Estimated US military spending is $934 billion for the period of October 2020 through September 2021. To give you an idea, the United States spends more on national defense than China, India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Brazil combined. The United States has also historically devoted a large share of its economy to the defense than many of its key allies. Defense spending accounts for 15% of all federal spending and roughly half of discretionary spending. Total discretionary spending for both defense and non-defense purposes represent only about 1/3 of the annual federal budget. The evolution of warfare and global crisis and national security requires unprecedented collaboration across borders and between the public and private sector around the world. We hope that this discussion will help shape the opportunity for the Harvard community and beyond to help preserve peace and eliminate global threats. So let's move on to today's discussion with our panelists. We will start with Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos to discuss all domain operations. We would like to start with the emerging technologies and the future of warfare of all domain operations. So Professor Joseph Nye became famous for a term he coined, soft power, and later evolved to smart power. He argues that having overwhelming technological power works best when you have an overwhelming admired culture that the world wants to create in their culture. Can you speak to how all domain operations, computer coordinated fight across land, sea, airspace, and cyberspace with forces from satellite to foot soldiers to submarines, sharing battle data at machine-to-machine speed are part of a smart power approach? Can you talk about the technology requirement to have such seamless operation? Can you also elaborate the 7 joint warfighting functions and in the context of all domain operations?
Thank you, Mahenoor. It's a pleasure to be here. I think before talking about all domain operations and emerging technologies, I think it's important to talk about what all domain operations is. I think many people who are watching are familiar with multi-domain operations, and this is what it is, combining different domains together. However, I think that we have seen a reemergence of a new kind of definition around this with the term of all domain operations. The vice chairman sees this term, the all domain operations, as something that combines more than just services, but also space and cyber deterrence, transportation, the electromagnetic spectrum, and missile defense. So it's much more than just the multi-domain coming together. It's multi-domain and everything in between. I also think that we need to understand that the operating environment has changed before talking again about all domain operations. And so moving at a faster pace, which means that we need to be able to not just deconflict between different services, but to be able to be operating in synchrony and at the speeds of relevance that are needed today. So enter in technology into all of this. I think we need to first understand that there are many legacy systems that are at play, and also that sometimes they don't communicate well to each other across different services. And I think that the JEDI initiative around the DoD cloud is a great effort to try and get the services to have one shared cloud that they can use in battle, but also trying to understand that procurement processes are very different between each one. But I'll put that aside just to speak about the 7 warfighting functions in the context of all domain operations. And so if we start, for example, with intelligence, we can see emerging technologies relevant here, like the Internet of Things and sensors coming together. But it is always a convergence of technologies that are coming together. And it will be a challenge, but I do think that there's enough in place to help try to mitigate that. For example, NSCAI, the Defense Innovation Board, things like SOFWorks or AFWorks, all of these initiatives are trying to bring the US military to a stage where we can have all domain operations at speed required. So if we think about intelligence, we can use artificial intelligence for natural language processing, you know, whether it's spoken or written, trying to manage information from sensors. It could be in any one of the domains, the sensors. And then if we think about movement and maneuver, we could think about robotics, carrying equipment. We could think about swarm maneuvers that are doing human-machine teaming. We can think about the advancements in quantum sensing, and then also military deception in maneuver. I think that there's a lot to be said about how AI and sensors can be spoofed. When it comes to fires, I think that we can already start to see how drones can make an impact in the kinetic sense, but then we can also see how bots online can make an impact in the non-kinetic sense. And of course, there are many other options out there. I'm just giving some examples. And then with information, I think it's important to flag the emergence of digital humans and avatars. And I'm not talking about a profile that is not real. I'm talking about a computer-generated image that looks exactly like a human, that moves like a human would in the digital realm. And people start to believe that this is a person, and even if they don't believe it's a person, they like the person, they're influenced by that person. And today that exists on Instagram in several different ways in the fashion industry and just the influencer kind of lifestyle influencer industry. And they have millions of followers. And I think that that is going to play a role in emerging information spaces, as well as augmented reality and virtual reality. When it comes to protection, I think that we've seen some interesting developments from Boston Dynamics around the robotic dogs, among other things. And we can also see that nanotechnology innovation can help with protection as well. Then in sustainment, I think we also have to consider that the future operating environment, which is actually also the present operating environment in this context of climate change. If we look at the Sahel, which is an important operating space right now when it comes to the VEO threat, we can see that the human body is challenged in this very extreme heat environment. And there's a lot that emerging technologies can do in this space. For example, in the civilian sector, there's this initiative by some entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley around, it's an X Prize, and it's on how to make water from air. And things like that are quite useful, I think, in the military context as well. And then lastly, with command and control, I think there's a lot to be said, given the speed cycles that are increasingly faster. Where having artificial intelligence inside the decision-making cycle can help reduce the cognitive load of the commander and accelerate the find, fix, finish, and engage cycle. And I think on this note, I think it's important to talk about all domain command and control. And I just want to ask Jake if he wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. I'm happy to add a bit to that. And I'd like to say thanks again to Mahenoor and to Harvard Tech in Seattle for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists. So I would address that by just following what you made in saying that today, the urgency, the sense of urgency for this push towards joint all-domain command and control is really underscored by the recognition that the US military today really has a digital connection deficit. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think most of us on this panel and listening today would probably understand that in our homes, 21st century life is characterized by various wireless devices operating in our house, Alexa, computers, laptop computers, smartphones, right? All sorts of platforms that we have that all connect to a single wireless network. And that's an expectation that we have, that all of us are going to be able to connect to that network. If I decide to make a phone call to somebody and I have T-Mobile and somebody else is using a different carrier, and just because we're using different cell phone carriers, we can't connect, that's unacceptable in the 21st century. What I think the public sometimes doesn't realize is we actually face that exact problem today in the United States military, where we have this digital connection deficit. Imagine what the consequences would be, for example, if frontline troops in the field are not able to digitally connect in the same way with our frontline fighter jets, right, or naval vessels that are operating in the area. And this is really driving the push to network our forces, because as we look at how we conceptualize the next generation battlefield, we're going to be increasingly moving away from a platform-centric thinking process of just looking at a platform for what its core functions are, and conceptualizing platforms for their ability to not only maybe launch a weapon, but actually being consumers or producers of information. And so the ability to make information ubiquitous across the battle space throughout all domains is really going to be the currency of next generation warfare. And something like the advanced battle management system that's going to underscore joint all domain command and control, I think is going to set up the framework for us to be able to do that, which is really setting up the joint force with this digital foundation and creating, if you will, a warfighter or a military internet of things. And this is so critical because, as I mentioned before, if we just take a modern example, let's go back to January of this year when American forces in Iraq were actually taking fire from Iranian ballistic missiles. A lot of the warning relays that were going to those troops were actually done by telephone, right? I mean, this is not exquisite technology to issue a warning. But what if we actually had, an algorithmic way of actually building some predictive analysis to be able to look at all of the steps that are in that process, anticipate the adversary action, and then send basically at the time, in real time, signals and warnings to those troops to then allow them to take evasive action across an entire theater. That's the speed and scale with which we need to transform our operations. And fundamentally, if we want to do that, that takes a digital transformation, which is exactly what we're all going to be talking about today. So thanks for letting me chat on that and talk about that a bit, Lydia.
The only last thing I would add is another challenge inside the operating environment is the fact that the actors are starting to gain better technology themselves, and that will increasingly challenge how it is we decide to engage in the art of war, so to speak. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia and Jacob.
Great. So let's go to our second question. Gina Honore, we have the question, which is, as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. With the overwhelming power that all domain operations represents, how do the leaders of the United States not only win the wars, but also win the peace? How do they eliminate threats while seamlessly rolling out the diplomatic red carpet? What is the line between DoD authority and action versus...
I'm still stuck on that first question.
Okay.
The previous question, because I think it's paramount to solving the problems that need to be solved. We're getting our young leaders through the academies and out of the universities. And if they want something, they hit their phone. You tell them where you want it, it shows up. Now, the way all that happened was some great investment in DARPA, through DARPA. The way that happened is Bill Clinton GPS, because we didn't want the Russian and the French to compete with that technology. So we take that same soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, and we put him in a fob on an outpost, and he's got a damn piece of wire. He's calling the sergeant to tell him, hey, I'm seeing something in the distance. Because we've taken away from him all that good stuff we created to order neckties and pizzas, that from a big defense investment on behalf of our country and peace and all those other good things, and we take all that from him. And as you were saying earlier, the phones don't care who make them or where you are now. You know, you could be in any country and make a phone call from your Apple Watch or yet the very thing that got us to do all that from that investment, we take it to the front lines, and if the soldier want to know what's on the other side of the hill, he's got to go in a secret little room in the back of the command center, and the G2 might let him in to get the information. You with me? Because it's been compartmentalized. So the very thing that industry and commerce has done to share information with the world, with the open, free internet, we go to warfare and we take that away because we said the enemy might see where you are, you know, or the enemy might hear what your next maneuver is. We've got to figure out how to operate that open communication system in a contested environment. That problem needs to be solved. And then once you solve it, you got to figure out how you're going to change it every 3 months, because the enemy will catch up with you. So I hope that's not confusing, but I think that's the big challenge, is how can we operate on your iPad at the front end of the fob, call in a B-52 strike, put in a deceptive unit moving in another location, send in a false intel report into the enemy, and call in artillery. by moving the mouse around. Because that's the strength of our technology, but we have not been able to transfer that to warfighting because of the security concerns. We need to solve those issues. And when you solve those issues, those 7 all-domain functions you talk about, we can get there. I think the technology is there. What's not there is the ability to secure it and change it frequently enough that we can protect information. When I was a major, we had a little thing called a Kick 13. What it would do is make a Army FM radio secure. And it was the quickest way to lose your career is to lose one. Because when you lost one, the entire security for every radio in the Army and Marine Corps and Air Force had to change. Because you had to assume the Russians had it. At that time, that was the biggest players. And I spent 3 months in a dump looking for it. The next day, they had to change all the codes. I think we need technology to give us that ability to operate across these domains and optimize the creativity of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen to be able to be keyboard smart, to integrate that at the time and place we choose. So we want to see first, understand first, and act first. We will not do that now because we're inhibited by security. People often wonder and ask me sometimes, well, how did you get all this done in Katrina? Well, the way we got it done was environment. So every soldier had his cell phone. Can you imagine that shit? Everybody was sending texts. There was no, Sergeant, call the lieutenant up at headquarters and tell him, have brigade send a helicopter down here to pick up 10 people that need to be evacuated. You know, send a text, 2 or 3 people to say it, and the helicopter was on the way. We were operating in a non-competitive enemy environment, if you understand what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So we're able to take a small force and do a lot because we were uninhibited by security and communications. Uninhibited. We could talk when we want, where we want, and it made a difference. And I apologize for that long answer to a question I wasn't asked, but that's what you smart people need to figure out. You know, how can we apply the Amazon Prime type feature? I want a B-52, I want an F-16 strike and a TLAM on this target. And it's done like that. And we're not worried about if it's secured or not. And bombs on the way. That is the only way we are going to continue to have a competitive advantage, is if we can optimize the technology we have now and that which is going to be created in the future, where you literally, it's like ordering off of Amazon, as opposed to the going through all these different ways of communicating to get that information to the bomber or to the strike fleet or whatever the case might be. Now, the real question you asked me is, we can win the kinetic war, if I understood it right, because our ability to overmatch, but how we translate that to peace on the ground. Was that the question? The second
That's the question. That is the question, yes.
Well, one of the reasons we can't do that effectively, number one, the enemy has a vote. And sometimes the people we're trying to help just want to be left the hell alone. And I've walked that ground in Afghanistan. I didn't fight a combat unit there, but I had a chance to make a couple visits there. And for all our investment in terms of fighting the enemy and the pseudo enemy there, here's a country that we've spent an enormous amount of resources, even putting highways in there and other things. But here's a country that grow tomatoes and import tomato paste. Here's a country that grows wheat and import flour. We didn't get it right. And generally speaking, we very seldom get it right when we go in to suppress the enemy and try to create our form of democracy someplace when our form of democracy don't match the local culture. And eventually they can get there. We saw South Korea get there. We saw after the Korean War, they had a very strong man government in South Korea. Matter of fact, they had that strong man, and I'm gonna say that in that way because that's the way it was, until the 80s. And they grew into a representative democracy. But I think our challenge has always been, how do we transition? And there have been some successes. I mean, most of Europe has and done pretty good as a result of our efforts there and in places like South Korea. But we're still in South Korea, don't forget. We're still there. That's 60 years. How do we translate that to Afghanistan and Iraq? Because we never took into account the decades of drew between Pakistan, India, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those British lines continue to haunt us because at the time they drew them, they did not draw them in the perspective of future harmony. They almost drew them, those lines of partition that created continuous conflict because they did not take into consideration the tribes. So I think when we go in, we need to have a clear objective on what we're trying to do. And going in and kill the bad guys, we can do that. But we have to partner with people who want peace on their terms and not necessarily peace the way we see it in the United States. And I'm sorry for the wrong answer, but it's been a few years since I've been sitting around the Pentagon and in national security meetings at the White House talking at this level about these things.
I'm going to ask Jake to add to this conversation. I really appreciate your response, and it was a great informative response. Jake, you have been involved with the strategic foresight and future studies. Can you please speak to the strategies that would secure peace in the most troubled regions, the Middle East, Russia, North Korea, globally?
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. I think, and I just want to thank General Honore for that. I think really great response, and I think we can all see how he really shows us what leadership means. So thank you for that, sir. Really appreciate it. I'll answer that, Roger, by saying that number one, we have to understand that the COVID-19 pandemic today is only accelerating what was already an exceptionally complex security environment that was frankly unprecedented. When you overlay the technological developments and then you overlay that on top of very, very trying geopolitical situations. So I would answer that by saying we've got to be prepared to deal in the currency of uncertainty. And that's really where future studies and strategic foresight can come in, because what that allows you to do is harness the weak signals and emerging trends that we see developing in the strategic environment, and then question our own assumptions. Question our own assumptions about things like strategic alliances, things like strategic interests around the globe, and then build scenarios. You know, maybe it's a continued growth scenario, maybe it's a systemic transformation, maybe it's a systemic collapse, the way we're seeing now in certain cases, or a discipline scenario. And then we need to take those scenarios and we need to actually ask ourselves the tough questions about future-proofing our strategic planning. 15 years ago, there were weak signals and emerging trends coming out of many, many countries, and if we look at what's unraveling today in the Eastern Mediterranean among the NATO members, countries that are supposed to be part of the same alliance, we actually see NATO members purchasing Russian air defense systems. We see the F-35 not being able to be delivered to a NATO partner based on that decision, which is $1 billion loss to the United States defense industry. So there's a tangible cost to ignoring ideological futures as much as tech futures. There's a nexus in between the two. And I think it's very, very important for us to consider that full range of options when we talk about facing the future uncertainty. So at the end of the day, you're never going to mitigate uncertainty. You have to become more comfortable in dealing with it. And that's really, I think, the value proposition that something like applying strategic foresight and future studies to national security, and then fostering a culture of futures-based thinking, rebooting our cognitive operating system. I talked before about a digital connection deficit that we have in the US military. I'd argue we also have a cognitive connection deficit. And what we really need to do to mitigate that is not just have pockets of excellence in some office in the Pentagon, but proliferate the knowledge and create excellence and access together, inclusivity, when we're thinking about this, so we can foster diversity in thought. And at the end of the day, I think, as was mentioned before, this idea of promoting democracy overseas in countries or populations that don't necessarily have any history of that in very, very complex environments, without a recognition of the commitment that that assumes, both in military force, in financial investment, and just frankly, the time commitment, that might not be the best value proposition moving forward. And that's the tough lesson that I think we've learned. I'll caveat that by saying I over the last 20 years. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Jake and General Honore. We will move on to our next question. This question is for Arjun Bisen. While the Department of Defense is conducting its own research and development projects into quantum computing, a bill introduced last month in the Senate is calling for a concerted national effort with DoD leading a consortium of industry, academic, and government institutions in a kind of Manhattan Project toward gaining quantum supremacy. So can you elaborate on why it is so important now for the US to be competitively advanced in quantum computing? How is it going to impact our society? What role can the public play?
Thanks, Mahenoor. This is a really fun question, but I'll try and be brief because there's so much you can speculate about a technology that has such a long time horizon. But I'll say 3 reasons why I think now is a critical time for quantum and why we're seeing these initiatives. The first is the potential of the technology itself. It has tremendous potential, so this is an incredible time to start investing and building these partnerships. The second relates to what I think is happening within the Department of Defense and the US government. And the third is strategic competition with China. So I'll start with the strategic competition with China. China named quantum informatics a key plank of their 5-year plan, and also a part of their Made in China plan, which launched China's bid to dominate high-tech sectors like quantum. They also use terms like quantum hegemony. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the last US budget had almost $500 million of investment in quantum technologies. That, you know, when a strategic competitor makes these kind of statements, you know, the US is going to start paying attention. Secondly, I think I'm really encouraged by how DoD and the US government has embraced technology with initiatives like the Defense Innovation Board and others, where they've brought in technologists. And I think these joint cross-industry efforts are a result of some of those more consultative processes, and maybe a recognition that when it comes to computation and AI, the US government has a lot to learn from academia and industry, especially in a field like quantum, where we don't exactly know what all the different uses could be. And industry and academia are exceptionally good at finding novel uses for new technologies. I think partnership model will really put the US ahead of many other competitors and governments. And then lastly, when it comes to the technology itself, quantum technology is a big umbrella and cover a lot of different sub-technologies. I think the most likely to be rolled out or productionized in the short term relate to quantum clocks and sensors. And I was talking to Lydia about this a few days ago, that really this is, we're talking 5 to 10 years out, where quantum clocks will help. We're already using them for GPS. So you could imagine a world where we're able to navigate without the need of satellites, which would really boost our stealth capabilities. Secondly, quantum sensors are so fine-tuned that they can detect magnetic and gravitational signals from kilometers away, which would help undermine opponents' stealth capabilities. China's already trying to use it for submarine detection and other threats. So stealth is a major place where this could, these quantum sensors could play a major role in both compromising and boosting our capabilities. More long-term, we're looking at quantum computing in its full sense of actually being able to use quantum switches and transistors and those kind of capabilities to increase our computational power exponentially. Transistors are already down to just coming to an end. Our ability to just use pure processing power with our standard chips, and we can see in the future, in the 10 years out, a sort of plateauing of capabilities there, and quantum offers the next leap forward, because an atom can be a 0 and a 1 and many other states at the same time. And so since September, Google announced quantum supremacy, and that they could produce a quantum computer that could outperform a supercomputer on a certain type of calculation. And the pace of that the pace of development here is only going to increase as competition is fairly ferocious in this space. What quantum computing will be especially good for is running many calculations in parallel. One of the motivating factors or examples of a problem that quantum physicists are trying to battle is maybe trying to overcome RSA type encryption. So breaking encryption is a major use case. At the same time, it's also great for creating even deeper levels of encryption. And quantum cloud allows us to scale this kind of processing power very quickly and give this capability to many users. So encryption is one. I think what Lydia and Jacob mentioned around sort of swarm coordinated activity in warfare, that's another area where quantum processing could rapidly increase our capabilities. Yeah, but I just want to flag that this is a long time away. We're only at like 50 qubits of processing power, and some of these would require tens of thousands, if not millions of qubits. So many years in the making. And one thing I'll add is, as the times difference between a technology capability and it very quickly becoming a technology threat has reduced, because the pace of technology is so fast. So while we're developing these capabilities, it's also important for DoD and the State Department to think about what norms and rules around the use of capabilities in warfare and in threats, like trying to build humanitarian law and norms around these at the same time as we're actually building the capabilities, so that we win trust, but also protect civilians while this is happening.
Thank you, Arjun. I would like to invite Dr. Sarah Kreps to add to the discussion.
Oh, I mean, I think what Arjun said makes a lot of sense. It seems like one of these technologies is probably always about 5 to 10 years out, but obviously essential for and promising in terms of increasing the precision for sensors. So it's not surprising to me that DoD has emphasized this as a priority in recent years.
Let's move on to the next question, Roger.
All right. So the next question is for Dr. Sarah Kreps. National defense and economic competition. The Department of Defense Technology Development creates valuable intellectual property that safeguards U.S. interests and also has the potential to create new innovative commercial products that can transform people's lives. Who decides the U.S. technology policy, and how is the decision made when balancing national defense and U.S. interests versus economic opportunities for firms?
So this is obviously a really big but also timely question because of some of the ongoing discussions about the TikTok case in the United States and whether the extent to which Chinese businesses will be able to have ownership and possibly gain access to US user data. So we know that national security and economic policy have always been overlapping spheres. So a country's military capability is derived from its economic capacity. And so the economic capacity determines the capability to exert and maintain political and social and economic independence. And so when those dominant economies are friends and allies, this isn't a big deal. When those economies are not allies, there starts to seem like a zero-sumness to this, where it's not a rising tide lifting all boats, but that one country is gaining at the extent of another. And so in this case, what we're seeing is that in this, it's China that is rising economically and now appearing to be a threat to national security. So now layer onto that kind of fundamental dynamic of this linkage between economic and national security, layer on globalization. And so the global economy has become networked in ways that raise the national security stakes. We have a world of strategic interactions and counteractions, threats, targeting, counter-targeting, and now decoupling, where we're trying to separate out some of those supply chains to decrease the vulnerability within them. And so globalization has really transformed the politics of sanctions and other forms of economic coercion. And so getting the most out of the world economy means investing abroad and generating revenue from consumers abroad. And we're living in this interdependent world. But so what does that actually mean? So these two spheres of national security and the economy are inextricably linked. So when we're thinking about technology policy and innovation policy and economics, we can't separate these out. And so the US is invariably weighing economic gain and national security risk. And so as we think about that kind of linkage, I wanted to illustrate with two different, kind of a software example and a hardware example of this. Which is, the first one is CFIUS, so the Committee on Foreign Investment of the US. And second is the Guidelines on Foreign Military Sales, and specifically the Missile Technology Control Regime. And both of these have been highlighted in recent months, and so they're both, I think, timely examples to use. So if it were all kind of free market and economic gain, we would see the US increases foreign direct investment and the sale of expensive military technology with abandon, but we don't see that. So CFIUS is the US Treasury, Defense, State, Commerce, and now Homeland Security. And so it was established in 1975 to study foreign investment in the US and try to suss out when these economic relationships have adverse national security consequences. And so one thing I was doing yesterday is plotting CFIUS notifications, which is to notify when a review of foreign direct investment has been initiated. And so it's very interesting because this has really ebbed and flowed, and it corresponds with kind of what our impressions probably are of these dynamics. So in the late 80s and early 90s, we had a significant peak, and these cases, the CFIUS cases, at that time were directed toward Japan. In the 2006 to 2008 period, we had another surge, and you probably recall the CNOOC, the Chinese state-owned energy company, trying to acquire a US energy company. So we had another CFIUS case. And now we're peaking again with these CFIUS cases directed toward China. So in May of 2019, there was an executive order to start to better understand these technology supply chain dynamics and assess the national security risk to critical infrastructure or the digital economy of the US, and deem whether it's an unacceptable risk and what the US should do about this. So again, this is Commerce, State, Defense, DHS, and all of this is a case-by-case basis, which in a lot of ways makes sense, but at the same time, it's not public. And so we're not privy to the national security calculations that are being made. So the case of TikTok has gained prominence. And these questions, I think, are hard to answer unless you're behind those closed doors. So does this allow the Chinese government backdoor access to troves of data about Americans that allow it to engage in digital personalization, targeting Americans like Russians did, or engaging in influence operations? How would we know, and how would we ascertain that they're not? How do you prove a negative in this case? And so the executive order that targeted TikTok pointed to the app's data collection practices and the potential for the Chinese government to gain access to that data. But the orders raise this, the executive orders raise the question about how the government looks at handling access to US personal data as a national security threat. But I think that trade-off here, as always, is between kind of what is deemed a national security concern on the one hand, and the adverse unintended consequences on the other. Because the counter argument to this suggests that not only is this not a national security threat, but CFIUS should not be meddling in the market because it undermines the US companies that are operating in China as a retaliation. So China has issued rules that allow it to halt exports, imports, and investments. They're coming up with their own list. And so the upshot in this first part is this, how we think about security risks, how we define them, and what the opportunity cost is economically in terms of losing the sort of net welfare enhancing benefits of comparative advantage and globalization. Because these protectionist measures, you can see the tit for tat aspect of them. So the US engages in its protectionist measures and has these retaliatory consequences. I'll talk more briefly on the question of hardware, because again, if it were simply that, well, there's economic gain and we're just out to make money, we would just sell as many weapons as we could. But we know that there are restrictions, and we know that these are not formulaic. So one issue that has come up more recently, but also in the last few years, is the international transfers of armed drones, UAVs. So for years, the US made the most capable armed drone, the Predator and then the Reaper, General Atomics. And countries in Europe and the US and the Middle East, have tried to buy this technology, but generally this has been proscribed because of the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is a 1986 agreement designed to restrict the transfer of nuclear delivery platforms, which obviously these drones are not. And in 1986, armed drones weren't even really on the horizon. And so one of the questions that's coming up, and that sort of tension between economic gain and national security risk, is how should we think, and international governance. So the US is part of this MTCR, but now has recently suggested that it will liberalize its interpretation and allow more transfers. The logic being, other countries now are developing this technology. So Israel, China, and Turkey have been making pretty decent, capacious drones that are also cheaper. And so the technology is proliferating. And at the same time, the US acquisition of this technology for its own force is also in decline, because we're drawing down in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the Middle East more generally. And so one way to kind of prop up the industrial base, and considering that this technology is already out there and proliferating, is for the United States to sell this technology. And so just to summarize, we've always had this linkage between economic security and national security. And I think that globalization has now just kind of made that linkage more salient. And what we're seeing now, I think, in some domains of that, is an attempt at decoupling on the software side. And then on this other side, I think we're seeing an interest in trying to kind of increase or prop up the US industrial base.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yes.
How much time we have left? Because I don't want to be a hog on the clock, and I know there's an end time. How much time we have left, Roger?
I have to ask Mahenoor, when are we ending this?
So initially we were planning for 1 hour and 15 minutes, but if needed, we can extend it, given that the panelists are available.
Okay, I'll be quick. And if I don't say anything else, I must say this, is that we've got to get quicker and better because the clock is running against us. As we go from 7 to 10 billion people, is going to create enormous challenges. Because in the next 30 years, we're going to have to produce 40% more food. That competition for food and water is going to create more civil unrest as we go from 7 to 10 billion people. So we have to accelerate what we're doing to be better at information. We're going to have to be better at the future consequences, as somebody was said earlier, because the problem's going to be insurmountable. China don't have a 5 million man army to fight us. They have a 5 million man army to control their population. And they're having food security issues already in China. They're importing most of their protein because the amount of arable land and their rise in the middle class has created this enormous problem and a hell of a pollution problem for them in Beijing, since everybody got a car and they put catalytic converters on. I'm saying that to tell you that the competition for security as we know it, I think is going to change. Particularly when we look at 30% of the food we produce now in the world is thrown away. So that creates moral issues with people around the world, or even people in this country that go to bed hungry at night. That competition to be food secure, to be water secure. Only 1% of the world's water is drinkable. And look at what we do to the rest of it. I had an argument with a general some years ago when we were talking about coming up with a new truck for the Army. He said, "Oh, General, we loggers are working for you. We're going to reduce the fuel requirement by 25%. So I said, it burns 100 gallons a day. Now it's going to burn 75. You're not helping us. We needed to take it from 100 gallons a day where it burns 5 gallons a day and go the same distance. Look what it would do to the Army if we didn't have to carry fuel. Look what it would do for our jets if we didn't have to carry. We could take one jet and do the job of 3 jets because it's got more speed, it's got longer lag time in the air, and it can go further. All that's limited now by fossil fuel. How do we put a marker so when you become old people like me, we don't have a requirement on a fuel nozzle to get our weapons where we want to go? Let's think about that. Somebody mentioned earlier about water from air. The technology's been around 30 years. How do we make that a reality where every Bradley fighting vehicle is producing water all the time, regardless of where it is, depending on the humidity, etc.? How we have a lot of water on the earth where we go because we go where people live. We don't go where people don't live by and large. And there's a water source. The problem is most of it is polluted. Most of the water in China is polluted. How do we create machines, regardless how polluted it is, we can drink it through a straw, or we create technologies that we hook into it and we got clean water. We've got to become unencumbered to fossil fuel and whether the water, you can drink it or not. That will reduce that burden on sustainment that we are so tied to right now. We have a tether and a restraint on us because of water and fuel. The information issues, y'all got that well in hand. But how do we get rid of last century's rucksack? And last century's rucksack is worrying about where we're going to get the water, how we're going to feed the troops, how we're going to feed the people. When we're going from 7 to 10 billion people, because I'm going to tell you, going from 7 to 10 is going to create more civil unrest in more places around the world because of climate change than we thought of. So I hope that in your future planning and the cells y'all working in, not necessarily this group, is that we've got somebody taking in the 7 to 10 factor. We're going to have this produced. It's going to be 15 years to get that. How do we take in the 7 to 10 factor with 10 billion people on the world? I just like to leave that before we run out of time, and as a thought piece for y'all to think about as we look at the future of how we deal with information and warfare.
Great.
Thank you, General Honore and Sarah. We will actually move on to our next question. So this question is for Dr. Jake Sotiriadis. Can you speak to the implications of automation and human machine learning on how we are developing future concepts? What does the promise of automation portend for our operational framework? Can you also address specifically the lethal autonomous weapon systems, about the norms for autonomous weapons and the ethical scaffolding around AI systems? Go ahead, Jake.
Thanks, Mahenoor, for the question. Let me approach it this way. There's a lot of talk and a lot of buzz, frankly, in the press and a lot of the tech publications about the promise of automation and what that really means and what are the implications stemming from that for military operations. I think what we really need to do, though, when we think about automation, and really what we're talking about there is human-machine teaming. So the extent to which we are going to basically have that synergy between basically algorithmic type frameworks, right, and still have our human capital labor-intensive processes move on. It's not necessarily a clear-cut issue. And I'll give an example. If you've got 200 people today in an intelligence capacity that are analyzing a particular area, let's say it's an air defense network for a particular region and an adversary. Now you have the potential, and this is not now, but down the line, to actually have all of that information, historical data, current locations, current operating parameters, frequencies, et cetera, basically at your fingertips, and you'll be consuming that information within seconds. Just because you've automated those processes doesn't mean that you've eliminated the need for contextualized knowledge. And what I mean by that is you're still going to have, it actually raises the premium on very contextualized knowledge sets in specialized areas, whether that's geopolitical, whether that's country specific, whether that's tech specific. That actually cuts across a whole range of areas. So what worries me today is that in sort of an excessive exuberance toward jumping towards a tech solution for every wicked problem that we see in the national security realm, and there's no doubt we need to remain number one and stay ahead of our adversaries in terms of AI development. Nobody's debating that. But are we really putting the necessary thought behind what our human capital requirements are going to be in 25 years or 30 years if we do end up with a sort of human on the loop type construct, and how is the breakdown going to come out in terms of the types of knowledge and skill sets we need to build? That concerns me, and I think we need to do a lot more thinking about what that looks like over the next few years. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. Arjun, Sarah, would you like to add to it?
Arjun, I'm happy. I had a couple of things to say, but go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Well, no, I just think it's been interesting to see the evolution on this because about more than a decade ago, when the ALICE program had been initially tested and then kind of paused, now kind of, and you know, now being unveiled and used to some extent again. I guess the charitable interpretation is that some of the bugs have been identified and filtered out. A different interpretation, which I think is consistent with what Jake was implying maybe, is that we're kind of warming to the technology as kind of the answer to our problems of identifying, targeting, and engaging, and thinking that there's like a technological solution to something that is a lot more subjective, which is identifying, for example, a combatant versus a civilian, which is a much more complex, that's not necessarily something that an algorithm can address. And so I guess for now, it seems as though the human will remain in the loop, but I wonder, just sort of projecting out from where we've gone in the last 10 years, whether we're kind of in this, I think there's a potential slippery slopeness to this, where we kind of now go down this, we gain sort of a complacency and increase our reliance to the point where we hand off more authority to the robot, and rather than kind of accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, +1 to that point. I think August Cole and Peter Singer in the futurist fantasy novels always talk about how the speed of warfare increases when you bring in an automation to the point where humans may not be able to keep up. And while we're not there yet, I think these questions could very quickly become real questions. And Atlas is probably the most advanced forward projecting weaponry, but the Navy has a range of close-in weapon systems that are like the Phalanx gun. Apologies if I mispronounced, but I think it's essentially designed to stop missiles as a last resort to try and like detect, and I think that's an area where, as we think about norms and like what humanitarian law might look like, I think those are defensive weaponry is easier to justify some of these autonomous activities around. But as Sarah mentioned, bugs are easier to detect when you have a lot of code in production, and it's really hard to get this right unless you're wargaming it significantly, and to really understand what like a recall or precision miss means in AI. Like, you really need to be able to test hundreds and thousands of times in real life scenarios. I mean, working in tech, like, we've had image recognition for decades, and it's still, we're finding new bugs every week, day. So I think, all of our assumptions are going to be tested in this space, and we may end up having to see this in live action before we're fully comfortable. And I'm just concerned that we don't necessarily have the frameworks in place to even approach those discussions.
Thank you, Arjun. Let's move on to the next question, Roger.
Okay, next question is for Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos. Kalimerasas, I'm told that's how you say good morning in Greek. When you think of university versus DoD, you get a very different image in your mind, and yet these two vastly different cultures have a strong track record of partnership and delivering revolutionary technologies. How does DoD choose a university partner or a defense contractor and prioritize putting together a team, resources, funding, etc. as we do partnerships? How can we ensure the security of state secrets? And I also want to open that up to the panel.
That is best answered by somebody who's an expert on that, and there are people who only deal with that. But I will say that the DoD has partnerships across the nation with universities across literally the whole country. And so we're not just talking about national labs. We're not talking about a DARPA. We're talking about actual university like Johns Hopkins or University of South Florida. And there are partnerships in that. But there are people who are literally experts on all of the legalities and how all of that works. So I would best leave that question to them.
Okay. Is there anyone else here on the panel that can add to this?
One of the things to really the university need to compete is to invest in a skiff to be able to get information that enough people need, so people outside the room can go see how they merge the technologies. But they just about need a skiff capacity if they're going to be able to merge what's happening in the labs and on the supercomputers to be able to match that back into the DoD system. That's been my experience with it, that they need a skiff.
What is a skiff? Can you?
That's a secure facility.
Okay.
Equivalent to the one that's in the Pentagon or any place that have access to secure information, as well as to be able to participate in counter cyber operations, et cetera. We have one here in Baton Rouge and at LSU that is getting a lot of DoD business and interagency because they built a skiff. They invested to be able to take problems inside the skiff, take it outside, go let the larger population work on it, and then bring the solution back in to plug and play. Just an idea.
I would just add to this that, you know, I thought the question was interesting, that it's sort of premised on the language here is strong track record of partnership between university and DoD. And I think that really is discipline specific. And one of the things that I think was problematic after Vietnam is that the social scientists in universities essentially disengaged from everything DoD related. And I think that was to the detriment of the military then going into Iraq and Afghanistan, just not having any of these, as many resources, social scientists who understood these regions as well. I think that is changing, but it has been fairly gradual. And I mean, I speak from, since it's a Harvard panel, direct experience with this, being ROTC at Harvard in the 90s, well, it was at MIT, and there was a lot of antipathy, that sort of post-Vietnam antipathy and holdover directed toward the DoD. And I think that has changed as DoD has changed some of its policies. And I think that has fostered a better working relationship between other disciplines within universities and DoD.
How do you think we can navigate that as we see there are going to be wars that aren't popular, and culture absolutely matters in terms of trying to win the peace? So how do we go forward and do something better, Professor Kreps?
Well, I think that there was a sort of conscious effort made to improve that relationship, and I think some of that dates back to the Petraeus years. I don't want to give him too much credit, but I think he really sort of generated a sense in which, you know, the university was not a place hostile to the military, and vice versa, creating a more synergistic relationship. And I think that has happened, has become a closer relationship since. And so I think that there's a warming between these two sides. I mean, I think some of this again was just the post-Vietnam sense that the social scientists had somehow led the military astray, and they would, and I still have colleagues who will not accept DoD money. I think these Minerva grants that provide money for social scientists to study important questions, that has helped. And so more kind of funding opportunities, because inevitably people are, a larger proportion of people will follow the money. And so I think there can be a win-win here.
Great.
Roger, could I add one quick thing just as a corollary? I think that's also what Sarah talked about is spot on, and I think it's a two-way street. So on the flip side, within the DoD itself and within the individual services, we also need to guard against sort of, you know, maybe a closet anti-intellectualism as well, right? And so we need to make sure that we're giving opportunities to our promising officers to go and get advanced degrees. And even if that means taking them out of a traditional operational assignment for 3 or 4 years so they can go get a Ph.D. in something that's going to be critical for national security, that needs to be looked at as equally important, as maybe a command assignment, right? Because it's a different world that we're operating in. So we need to also look at leadership and skill sets in a different way. There's not just one cookie cutter approach. So I think that both sides obviously have a responsibility. There needs to be a partnership between the two. But in terms of a culture, we need to make sure that it's transparent on both sides of the fence. Thanks.
Right. I would just, it reminds me of just a quick anecdote when I was in the Air Force and I wanted to do a PhD through the Air Force. And the colonel I was working for said, well, I don't know how, basically he said, I don't know how I would handle having a 28-year-old captain who has a PhD. It was just this sort of sense, this anti-intellectualism. And I have every year, I have about 1 or 2 Army PhD students that come to Cornell to work with me. And I do that in part, I think, because I didn't have the same opportunities. And that's in fact why I got out of the Air Force. But I want to provide that to the extent that one person can, that linkage between those two worlds, because I think it benefits both.
It's a great discussion. Thank you all. Now we will move on to the participant submitted question. Majority of the audience questions have already been addressed through our discussion. Patrick Andres and Doan Lee, their questions were related to public-private partnership. We already covered that. James Chang actually asked question on quantum computing. So we already covered that too. This question is submitted by Robert Montac Tristan, and then also Emma McCarthy had a similar question. So the question is, what is DoD policy and investment in the field of heavy human enhancement? For example, neuroenhancement and robotics. Should human gene editing be a priority for the DoD? How does the US DoD investment in human enhancement compare against top nation states and non-state actors? I would request Jake and Lydia to address this first, and then the rest of the panelists can chime in.
I'll start. I can't speak to most of that, mostly because it's kind of really hard even to know, and that is probably something that's not public anyway. However, I do think that if you look at what's available online, you'll see that there's a tremendous interest in understanding human performance. And human performance has a big range. It's about sleep, it's about brain performance, it's about muscular performance. And also you'll see, there was a Wired article, actually a really interesting one about DARPA research and human-machine interface. I don't think that we're there yet, but it's something that seems to be of interest both on the civilian side and the military side. Civilian side being Elon Musk with his company called Neuralink. So I think that it's one of those things where we're too early in the game, but it's something that if there's a lot of interest today, we may potentially see something in the future. And I'll let it go over to Jake now.
Thanks, Lydia. Yeah, so there isn't really a whole lot that I'm going to be able to talk about with respect to the specific programmatics, just in terms of what's actively being discussed. But I think what might be of interest to the conversation and to sort of take it maybe in even a bit of a different direction is when we talk about competition in a post-COVID world, and we look at where do we go from here. I think one of the takeaways that we really have to consider as a lesson learned from this entire experience is this notion of what national security really is writ large. And I think what we'd all probably agree with after this experience is that what we've traditionally understood as national security is a much larger concept than what we currently understand, and really how we are organized says a lot more about the way we think, right, and how we actually process information than maybe even the problems and the challenges that we face. And just an example of that would be, moving forward, what about this notion of, a future scenario where now we have, national biodata stockpiles being as important to national security and mapping the genetic profiles of an adversary's population and understanding the genetic profiles of one's own population, right? What kind of a window of rhythmic readiness does that create when now countries would recognize, based on the experience of COVID-19, that you would maybe have a 5 or 6 week window of opportunity to pursue aggressive action because the populations of one of your competitors or the infrastructure may be bogged down with that. And also, kind of extrapolating from that, and just to close with this, after 9/11, there was an increasingly, an increasingly increased willingness to accept surveillance, that trade-off between surveillance and security, right? We've never flown the same way since 9/11. However, we're seeing that today, perhaps we might be able to accept a bigger surveillance regime in the name of public health. We're seeing, drones being employed internationally, not necessarily in the US, as a means to control, biodata and health statistics for populations. And I think that that's going to be a debate that will come out of this situation and experience that we need to be prepared to have as we move ahead.
Thank you, Jay.
I think we need to reflect and see what has happened here recently. During the Revolutionary War, the British used to take contaminated bodies and place them in villages so people could get sick. And now we see COVID. It didn't arrive by a nuclear weapon. It didn't necessarily arrive by a supersonic jet, but it happened. And I think all of us want to believe it happened like many epidemics in the past. But what happened when you weaponize epidemics? And we can't assume that every country will have the morals not to weaponize. It's done as much as it has the power of about 30-some thousand nuclear weapons that we still maintain to paralyze a nation. In World War II, the Japanese used gas-filled balloons to set fires on our West Coast. They weaponized balloons. And this year we saw the impact of the wildfires. Well, when I was in the Pentagon, we knew for a long time that most of those Western fires this time of year were set by firemen who were seeking the extra work in many cases. That was the intelligence coming into the National Command Authority. And we've never gotten a hold of that, but it has the impact of a small nuclear weapon going on when you look at the impact on the economy, people, infrastructure. So I think we have to continue we use that word soft power earlier, is how do we use, and I'm not sure soft is the right word to use with it, but we're very vulnerable. We wanted to forget about bio back in the day. Because we didn't like operating in a biochemical environment, but it has not forgotten about us. And things that we may assume that could be naturally forming, what happened when people start weaponizing that? They don't need a nuclear weapon. They don't need a supersonic. They could bring a few vials of anthrax and take it in the Midwest or hoof and mouth disease and destroy our herds. So I think we got to be holistic in our thinking, that we don't get so good at information and the kinetic, and we forget about those things that happen in the natural world, like it be duplicated, that they appear to be natural forming, but they're not. They're induced by enemies of the state and of each other's state, and they can have detrimental impact on a population. I just add that. Hopefully that's also in the mix as y'all look at the future.
Excellent. Thank you, General Honore. We are actually ready to wrap up now. On behalf of the Harvard in Tech Seattle, Roger and I thank you for your time today. Our panelists, Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos, Arjun Bisen, Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, Dr. Sarah Kreps, and General Honore, thank you. It is a great pleasure to have you as our panelists. It was an informative session and we have learned a lot. To the participants, thank you for joining us today. It is remarkable how significantly all of our lives have changed over the past months. We hope you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy during COVID-19. We are grateful for the connection and strength of the Harvard alumni community. Thanks to your generosity and support. Hope this webinar will bring in some thought-provoking discussion. If you're interested in learning more, please join us at Harvard in Tech Seattle. Thank you and goodbye for now. Bye.